Hi everyone, welcome to our Scratch programming tutorial. Today we're going to learn how to manage two super important parts of any game, lives and scores. These are the things that make games fun and challenging. So by the end of this video, you'll know how to create a game where players have a certain number of lives, earn points, and lose when they run out of lives. So let's get started. Before we dive into the fun stuff, let's talk about what you learn in this video. First, we'll look at variables. Variables are like little storage boxes in your game that hold important information, like how many lives a player has or their score. We'll also talk about why it's important to give your variables clear names, like lives or score, so you don't get confused later. Next, we'll write some algorithms. That's just a fancy word for step-by-step instructions to track things like lives and scores. Finally, we'll learn about comments. Comments are notes you leave in your code to remind yourself or others of what your code does. Believe me, comments are a lifesaver when your code gets complicated. Now let's talk about sprite interactions. In games, things happen when sprites, like characters or objects, interact with each other. For example, in Pac-Man, when Pac-Man touches a ghost, he loses a life. But how do we make these interactions happen? First, we need to decide when the interaction should occur. Should it happen all the time, like in a forever loop, or only when you press a key, or maybe when the game starts? Next, we need to set a condition. A condition is like a rule. For example, if Pac-Man is touching a ghost, then something happens. Finally, we decide what happens when the condition is met. Does the game end? Does the player lose a life? Or maybe the sprite changes color? These are the kinds of decisions you make when creating your game. Let's talk about two super important tools in programming: loops and conditions. A loop is something that happens over and over again. For example, in a game, you might want to check constantly if the player is touching an enemy. That's where a forever loop comes in handy. It keeps checking the condition forever. A condition is something that only happens if a certain rule is true. For example, if the player touches an enemy, then they lose a life. We use if-then blocks to make this happen. So loops and conditions work together to make your game run smoothly and respond to what the player does. Pause the video for a minute and analyze the blocks of code that you see on your screen at the moment. Okay, great. Now that you know about loops and conditions, let's see how we can use them to make your game even better. By combining a forever loop with an if block, you can create smooth movement and interactions. For example, you can make a character move around the screen and check if it's touching an enemy at the same time. This makes your game feel more polished and fun to play. Again, maybe consider taking a minute to analyze the blocks of code that you see on your screen. When you are ready, you can unpause and then carry on with the rest of the video. Okay, great. Let's talk about variables. So a variable is like a container that holds a piece of information. Think of it as a box where you can store a number. like how many lives a player has or their score. For example, you could create a variable called lives. So again, a variable is like a container that holds a piece of information. Think of it as a box where you can store a number, like how many lives a player has or their score. For example, you could create a variable called lives and set it to 3 at the start of the game. As the player makes mistakes, you can reduce the number of lives. Variables are super powerful because they let you keep track of important information and change it as the game goes on. You could also apply the same concept of variables and store health or lives for games that you create. Now let's design an algorithm. Excuse me. An algorithm is a step-by-step plan for how lives will work in your game. First, we need to set the starting number of lives. Let's say the player starts with 3 lives. Next, we need to check constantly if the player is touching an enemy. If they are, we'll subtract 1 life. This is where loops and conditions come in handy. We'll use a forever loop to keep checking for conditions or collisions, and if block to reduce the lives when a collision happens. So to repeat again, we'll use a forever loop to keep checking for collisions and an if block to reduce the lives when a collision happens. Let's put this into action. When the game starts, we'll set the player lives to 3. Then, during the game, we'll use a forever loop to check if the player is touching an enemy. If they are, we'll subtract 1 life. This is how you create a sense of challenge in your game. If the player runs out of lives, the game can end. But don't worry, we'll talk about how to end the game later in the video. Next, let's talk about scoring. Scoring is what makes games rewarding. You can earn points for doing things like collecting items, solving puzzles, or beating a timer. To display the score, you can use the show and hide blocks. These blocks let you control when the score is visible on the screen. For example, you might want to show the score during the game, but hide it when the game ends. Consider analyzing the blocks of code for score on your screen at the moment. Maybe pause the video for a minute and take a look. And once you're ready, you can carry on. Did you know that you can customize how variables look on the screen? You can choose to show or hide them, display them as numbers or sliders, and even make them movable. For example, you might want to show the player's score in a large font at the top of the screen. Or you could use a slider to let players adjust the difficulty of the game. The possibilities are endless. You just need to give it a go and try all of these things that we've been discussing. Let's add a scoring system to your game. Just like we did with lives, we'll use a variable to track the player's score. Every time the player does something good, like collecting a coin, we'll increase their score. This is a great way to make your game more engaging. Players love seeing their score go up as they play. Every game needs a way to end it. In Scratch, you can use the stop block to end the game when certain conditions are met. For example, if the player runs out of lives, you can stop the game and display a message like game over. This gives the player a clear signal that the game has ended and lets them know how well they did. Finally, let's talk about comments. Comments are like little notes you leave in your code to remind yourself what it does. For example, you might write a comment like, "This block sets the starting number of lives." Comments are super helpful, especially when you're working on a big project or sharing your code with others. They make your code easier to understand and help you avoid confusion later. Plus, they're a great habit to develop as a programmer. And that's it. You've learned how to manage lives, add scoring, and create game over mechanics in Scratch. Now it's your turn to try it out. Experiment with variables, loops, and conditions to create your own unique game. Don't forget to add comments to your code so you can remember how it works later. Thanks for watching and happy coding. See you in the next video.